A good day. It's Sunday, August 16th, 2020. You know, when you're involved in a political campaign, it can be a challenge to figure out how to approach information that has been presented by your opposition. Some people get very dirty. Sometimes, if you get too mired in the dirt that you can dig up on the opposition, you neglect to actually promote your own campaign. And so, by the time you get elected, it puts a significant amount of pressure on whatever you did promise, especially if you made promises about what you were going to do in the first 100 days. I read an evaluation at some point in 2016. It said the primary political capital a president has is in his first year. But it's ironic as well because the president's first year is usually based on the budget set up by the previous president. If you weren't in the legislature and you weren't even a governor of a state, then it's a very different process for you. That's one of the things that the Trump administration has been able to teach the American people, if we were willing to be amenable to paying attention to it in that manner. Trump came in with the president's budget set up before he came in. He was not in government. So his first year and his first years where the political capital expenditures were based on what he came into. This is the way it is for every freshman president, every incoming president. If you're in the legislature and you get to participate in the budget process and pass that budget prior to getting elected, it's different. Yesterday was August 15th. My understanding is August 15th, generally speaking, is the deadline by which the president submits his final budgetary priorities to Congress. Presumably, there's been several months of negotiation between Congress and the president about what the budget priorities are supposed to be for the next year. Congress is supposed to put it through the appropriations process it has, and by the time the calendar year comes around next year, that's what America has. We're in a presidential election year. There are very significant matters that need to be addressed and attended to. I personally have been trying to get some acknowledgement of my very significant concerns regarding the federal budgeting process for the last 3 years. I've even submitted 3 petitions, original petitions, to the Supreme Court of the United States, challenging misinformation and other problems that I believe are actually criminal connected to the congressional budget process. I have not, as of yet, received an audience before any court in the United States at any level of jurisdiction. I have had every effort denied. But the judicial branch of government is an actual branch of government. One thing I've been following, however, is what would be considered executive notices. In some ways, what I have come to understand in the last year is the best way to follow what's going on is to look at it as if you're a corporate CEO. Do I have experience in this regards personally? No. But what little I do have and know makes a lot of sense. In May 12th of 2017, there was a local policy change that went into effect in Houston, Texas. There was a situation where the homeless people that were sleeping under the bridge continuously got swept out from under the bridge. There was some protest, and the understanding is that the city council had implemented a law that by May 12th required the homeless to put all of their belongings into a 3 by 3 by 3 foot box. I had been witness to someone who represented themselves as the chief of police offer to help people off the books, so to speak, with their tickets for loitering. And a great deal of what happens when you're sleeping under the bridge and get swept out is a ticket for something equivalent to loitering. But somehow, putting your belongings in a 3 by 3 by 3 box would keep you in compliance with a new ordinance. My concern was that in my investigation the previous year, when I was in another city, I had come across information about how a port system in the United States was going to be the first port to use collateral on shipping containers, the inventories on shipping containers as collateral on loans for companies or entities that were affiliated with the inventories in those shipping containers. Now, while this process had been done in other countries, it had never been done in the United States before. My understanding was 2015 was the first year that such policies had been approved for implementation during 2016. There had been changes to the international maritime industry that allowed for a new kind of shipping container. And if you took 100 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot boxes and stacked them appropriately, it would fit inside one of these new shipping containers. My concern was that what was really happening is that that 3 by 3 by 3 foot shipping container was supposed to represent some sort of metaphorical representation of the human capital associated with whoever would be subject to that charge. And if you got busted for loitering, then an inventory of your human capital would be available to law enforcement and to whoever it was involved with that effort. A number of city attorneys challenged it on civil rights grounds. I tried to go to the city council meeting, but because my identification had been stolen and I had not yet received the forged document that was to be provided by the police at that time, I was not able to go to the city council meeting. I gave that information to somebody else who represented herself as an activist organizing people on the street. But less than a year later, she was in the same area assisting the homeless and telling them that if they had a problem with their tickets, to come to her because she knew how to help them. I do not believe she took that information I had in good faith. I think she took that information and hustled a deal with the same police officer I was attempting to have somebody bring up on charges. My understanding is by the time I encountered him, despite the fact that he represented himself as active, he was actually the retired chief of police. Now we're in a very important situation. At the beginning of this calendar year, a major change took place in the maritime sector. There were certain environmental requirements that were being implemented for international maritime vessels. Presumably, they were supposed to implement certain technology standards in order to reduce the amount of pollution that they created as part of their travel overseas. One of the things that they were potentially required to do was to implement or put on board a form of technology that is described as a scrubber to remove sulfur and other kinds of toxins from the environment. Now, this is part of a multi-stage process. They call it SOx, but then there's also something called NOx, right? Which is supposed to have its deadline coming up in the next few years. The point of the matter is that every vessel in the maritime sector was supposed to be compliant by this year. This year was the year for compliance. We are talking about major changes. We're also talking about kinds of reductions that are expected for this year that are substantial. The differential between what was previously permitted in terms of emissions versus what would be required in order to be compliant was very significant. My concern is that it had to do with manipulation of legislation in the United States regarding air quality standards, as well as proposals for a carbon trust and these discussions about carbon capture and or carbon sequestration that are not explicated and that I also understand are used in significant derivative processes. I believe they've been doing that all year. And I believe that they have been taking security documents connected to people's identities and using them as insurance or collateral for this process regarding maritime vessels, and that certain people have been biophysiologically and psychologically impacted. That's part one.